the Paris Agreement, it was designed at a time when what I would call peak globalization. 10 years on, we look at the Paris Agreement and we say, well, it was designed around a globalized world, but we don't really have a globalized world anymore. So how is that going to work? Did we foresee deglobalization when the Paris Agreement was being negotiated? Probably not. Is that what we have today? Yes, that's the reality.
Welcome to Smarter Markets, a weekly podcast featuring the icons and entrepreneurs of technology, commodities, and finance, ranting on the inadequacies of our systems and riffing on ideas for how to solve them. Together, we examine the questions: are we facing a crisis of information or a crisis of trust? And will building smarter markets be the antidote? This episode is brought to you in part by Abax Exchange, where trading in centrally cleared, physically deliverable LNG and carbon futures contracts is now underway. Ready for smarter markets?
Welcome back to our Summer Playlist 2024 on Smarter Markets. I'm Dave Greeley, Chief Economist at Abax Technologies. Our guest today is Peter Zaman. Peter is a partner at HFW in Singapore and has been practicing law in climate finance and environmental markets since 2004. We'll be discussing the state of play in carbon markets and what the SBTI statements this week, the uncertainties facing CORSIA participants, and the EU's new methane regulation tell us about how disputes over what constitutes the right approach to addressing carbon emissions are having practical consequences for our ability to make meaningful progress, and what we need to be doing next. Hello, Peter. Welcome back to Smarter Markets.
Thanks, Dave. Thank you for having me back.
Oh, it's always good to have you back. I was looking forward to talking with you because when I read the carbon market headlines this week, they're dominated by the Science-Based Targets Initiative sticking, for now at least, with its restrictive stance on the use of carbon credits to meet corporate net zero targets, and also describing carbon credits as being, quote, mostly ineffective. And I thought about that sweeping statement, carbon credits are mostly ineffective, in contrast to the many nuanced and some might say weedy conversations that you and I have had over the years on these markets. And I thought to myself, what's going on here? Obviously, carbon credits are part of the Paris Agreement. They're part of the EU emissions trading scheme. So is the criticism about the voluntary carbon markets. But then shouldn't the discussion be about methodologies and accounting and which methodologies are used and how the offset accounting is done? And the thought entered my mind, is this really an ideological disagreement masquerading as a technical argument? And that might be too loaded a question to start off with, Peter. So I think I'll ask you instead, what do you make of SBTI's decision and statements on carbon credits this week?
Talk about starting the conversation with a loaded topic. Their position in reality is no different than it has been in the past. Right? And I think that's probably my main takeaway. 300 pages of materials, a lot to digest in 24 hours, so I can't promise you that I've digested everything, but the thrust of it seems to be we're sticking to what we said and always have said is our approach, with a few little bit of stuff along the edges, like talking about using insetting opportunities as opposed to offsetting opportunities. But I think I'll pick you up on your use of the word carbon credit and clarify it by saying I think we're predominantly talking about carbon offsets when we talk about voluntary markets and voluntary corporate decarbonization goals. Now, voluntary corporate decarbonization goals need carbon offsets because what they're trying to do is they're essentially saying there are unabatable tons that represent 1 ton of emissions in my corporate value chain that I just cannot do anything about, either because they're outside of my control, i.e. they're my scope 3 emissions, and therefore I have no choice but to try and use a -1 GHG offset to neutralize the impact of my +1 emission. So the idea of using a carbon credit represented by a carbon offset is the accounting equivalent of +1 -1 neutralizes me to 0. And the issue is for hard-to-abate emissions, whether it's in hard-to-abate emission sectors like aviation or shipping, or whether or not it's hard-to-abate emissions in the regular context of corporate GHG accounting, main question is, how far can you push the ticket? right? And if you think about scope 1 emissions being within the control of the corporate entity, scope 2 emissions being somewhat within their control in some cases because they can choose their supplier of power, but that's not always the case that they have a choice. And thirdly, you get into scope 3 where they have no control whatsoever. To insist that your scope 3 emissions have to be decarbonized entirely is the equivalent of saying you basically have to stop your supply chain entirely, which is not really pragmatic, or you need to change your supply chain entirely, which again is often not very pragmatic. And if you are going to change your supply chain entirely, at what cost? Nobody repairs their mobile phone anymore. They just throw it out and get a new one. And that's because we live in a world where the cost of buying a new mobile phone is often cheaper than having it repaired. And that basically is a reflection of the fact that we live in low-cost supply chain solutions. So the products and the commodities that we use in order to supply the way we live is now designed in a globalized world against the least cost production source. So if you start looking at a scope 3 decarbonization agenda that says you can only use certain types of zero emission supply sources, you are essentially saying to every consumer who is going to pick up the bill that you're going to bear the cost of an SBTI commitment. Now, if SBTI's commitment, therefore, are absolute because they don't allow or recognize wiggle room necessary for companies who've done their best but just haven't been able to sort of commit suicide by going down net zero commodity supply chains, then you're left with a world in either which companies walk away from SBTI because they're too hard to commit and too hard to achieve, or somebody who is signing up to SBTI is forced to pass on the cost to the consumer or is non-competitive in its product offering to the market. And that's the consequence of a hardline approach that SBTI, I think, unfortunately, is adopting. So really, for me, the question is not that I'm surprised with what SBTI has said. I think the question really is now, what will corporates do? Because corporates have a choice. It's a voluntary program. They can walk away from SBTI like Air New Zealand has done recently, and a whole raft of other very well-known or reputable companies have done. Or they can stick it out, but if you are going to stick it out, the question is to what end? Because it seems to me that with the lack of flexibility in the SBTI approach, what you're doing as a corporate is essentially either signing up to it knowing fully well you'll never be able to achieve it, and therefore you're doing it for brand recognition, for labeling purposes, or something else, or you're doing it as a means to setting yourself up for failure compared to everybody else in the corporate world who isn't signing up to SBTI. And I don't see any board of a company voluntarily saying that committing suicide in that manner is a sensible way forward. And that's kind of where I see the dilemma or the consequence following from the SBTI position. And it's a relatively hardcore position.
Yeah, and we need to all be prepared to do hard things, but we can't be asking people to do impossible things, or as you said, committing corporate suicide. And SBTI has no enforcement power. It has had a lot of influence. So I'm curious, when you look at the stance they're taking now and the options available to corporates who have made or are contemplating making voluntary commitments, what do you think the implications of their staying with their stance this week on voluntary carbon markets? What will the implications be on the markets and on SBTI's place in them?
Let's deal with the markets first. Voluntary carbon credit demand has been on the wane for quite some time. I mean, it's not something that's happened overnight. It's happened progressively over the course of the last 18 months. And if you think about it from the perspective of a project developer or an originator of voluntary carbon credits, if there is no demand, that means there's no flow of climate finance moving from the corporate world into the projects that need to be supported. So the reality is the procrastination by SBTI on making it has got to the point where 18 months, 2 years down the line, we're in a position where the flow of carbon finance is either stopping entirely or has stopped already. And if you think about the role of the intermediaries or the project developers who are in that chain trying to generate the opportunity of carbon offsets, it basically means for them a cutting off of financial flow that they need in order to fund the activities. So that's the market side of it. And now, the more practical side of it is the fact that we are running up against the clock in terms of how we meet the 1.5 degree target. We're running out of time. We've got the lost decade of 2010 to 2020 that's been caused by us abandoning the Kyoto Protocol and replacing it with the Paris Agreement. We haven't necessarily done anything in those lost 10 years to now be in a position to make up time. And countries who wish to make up that time by putting in very, very rigid and fast-paced new legislative developments mandating and forcing GHG emission controls in their country do run the risk of essentially being very, very unpopular very, very quickly. So what we've got now is this difference between how much can a country do at the government level and still remain electable versus what you can do to make up for their shortcoming by encouraging voluntary corporate activity. The original idea behind corporate voluntary activity was that it would be a voluntary effort by the corporate sector to make up the shortfall of what the state's ambition is unable to do in the consistency of a 1.5 degree goal. But instead of trying to encourage the corporate to take on a role, a greater role, we've seen the opposite happen. We've seen them being scared away by accusations of greenwashing. Words like green hushing have actually become part of the vocabulary because we got to the point where corporates are too scared to say they're doing anything good, because the minute they try and do anything good, somebody comes and slaps them with some kind of allegation, lawsuit, or at the very least, some kind of journalistic expose. And the consequence of all of that is, if I'm doing this voluntary at the level of a corporation, it is voluntary. And if it is voluntary, I can choose to do nothing. And in fact, that's what the nature of voluntary efforts, when they are pushed to their absolute limits by rigidity and inflexibility, will do. They will take those corporates and encourage them to say, better to do nothing than be beaten about reputationally. So I fear that one of the biggest practical consequences of all of this is, not only are you killing off the supply or potential for supply of carbon offsets by lacking in not giving clarity to the market as to whether or not demand for these credits is there. And the demand side of the equation is now being, if you will, limited or reduced or restricted by the positions adopted by influential organizations like the SBTi. You're absolutely right to say that they are not an enforcement body, they're not a regulator, and people can walk away from them anytime they want to. The question, I think, that corporations will be asking themselves now is, why should we not walk away?
You said a word that really resonates with me, which is procrastination. You know, it almost seems like it's easier to say you'll do something really good someday than do something good but not perfect today. And of course, as you said, 1.5 is rapidly moving towards the rearview mirror, and 2 might be the more realistic target going forward. So I'm curious, when you talk with people in the markets, your clients, other people active in trying to wrestle with this carbon emissions challenge that we all have, are you seeing incremental but meaningful progress being made across whether it's voluntary markets, compliance, regulatory, and dealing with carbon emissions? How do you see the state of play in these markets? Because when I kind of see sweeping headlines like the ones this week, sometimes it almost feels like, what, are we really back at square one, where we're just trying to decide if things are effective or ineffective? And of course, that's not true. But where do you see the state of play right now?
We spent the best part of the 2004 to 2010 period of the Kyoto Protocol, or 2012 years of the Kyoto Protocol, trying to understand how to use carbon units and how to price carbon units as a means to incentivize behavior. I mean, if you think about EU ETS today, that's essentially the personification of that concept. But what we are trying to do now is we're measuring what we did back in 2004 to 2012 as, if you will, our very first attempt at trying to do that. And we are criticizing it in 22 to 2024 by saying, what you did back in 2008 was crap. And I think to a certain extent, there is a lot of merit to identifying why there are just criticisms that are applicable to the efforts in the carbon offsetting space. But we are, in practical terms, 20 years now of having done that and learning lessons and continuing to learn lessons. And we have been tweaking the rules, and we have been understanding MRV processes better. We have been working out how to use technology as a means to ensuring accuracy of data better. And all of that learning, all of that experience is about to be thrown out and replaced with something which we've never done before. We're investing in a technology that is now very expensive. Some will say that the cost of a proper technology-based permanent removal is $1,000 a ton today, with hope, and I emphasize the word hope, that by 2030, because of growth and scale, that might come down to $400 a ton. Now, at $400 a ton for a removal credit, as being the only sanctioned type of offset unit that the world can use, well, how many countries are going to be able to afford that? If you went to the United States, even today, as one of the most successful and high earnings per capita countries, and you said to them, the cost of your carbon footprint per ton is $400, and we expect you to pay for that. Whether you ask that of a rich corporation or whether or not you ask that of the individual citizen who's going to pick up the tab eventually, that is not an acceptable price. And yet what we're doing is we're saying that is the price that we insist everybody pays because it's the only true -1 ton that we can count on. And all of the other -1 tons that are out there, we discount them, we discredit them, we ignore them because we don't believe that the environmental efficacy of them is worth fighting for. And that is the thrust of where carbon markets 2.0 today have fallen on its face, in that they've now said that we essentially do have to have perfection, because without perfection, we're not going to achieve the outcomes we want. But for that perfection, we're willing to wait until 2039, which is when we're going to need the carbon removal tons to balance out what's left of our exhausted carbon budget or overused carbon budget. And in the meantime, we're just going to have a wing and a prayer hope that we're going to get there somehow by 2039. And by the way, discourage you, the corporations in the meantime, to do what you could have done by reducing your emissions using reduction credits. That's the thrust of where we are. If you take a step back from all the noise, from all of the jargon and all of the rubbish that you hear being thrown about between the proponents in favor and the proponents against, the thrust of where we land is exactly there. And my point is, $400 a ton for permanent removals is not something the entire world can afford. It's not something even the richest countries can actually afford. And the politicians who are designing those frameworks are not being realistic, and they're not being honest. And think about it this way. It's $400 a ton because you're trying to force the speed at which you're trying to do this in a 1.5 degree target world. The science is telling us we're past 1.5 degrees. We're never going to get 1.5 degrees. It's pretty much unachievable based on where we are today in terms of how much carbon budget has been burned. But no one's having a conversation about that. In fact, they're putting an artificial 1.5 degree number when the world is in fact going to be a 2.2 degree world. So you are, by not accepting the fact that we're away from or never going to get to 1.5 degrees, you're actually inflating the cost of what your citizens need to pay or should pay in a comparable manner to what other citizens in other parts of the world might land up paying. And that creates trade tensions between the countries who are overpaying and the people that they feel are underpaying. And that trade tension is going to play out very, very significantly over the course of the next 5 years as those policies get implemented throughout the world. Throw into the mix what happens with a Trump presidency, if the Trump presidency turns towards the Paris Agreement like it did last time and says, you know what, this is all a hoax, let's walk away from the Paris Agreement. If that also happens, where do we go? At that point, we have no international tool to coalesce people and countries around activity. So the way to think about voluntary carbon markets is as a hedge against a lot of problems that will follow from countries not doing the right thing. So instead of encouraging corporations to do what they can do, we're demonizing them for doing that. And that is the irony of essentially what has happened in Carbon Markets 2.0. And the people who've been pushing that are the ones who know that that is the result of what they're doing. But they have their own reasons for doing so. And I don't think those reasons are necessarily rational. So whether they're personal, whether or not they're ideological, I don't know. But they're certainly not rational, because the rational thing to do is to deploy every tool you have available to you to deal with what is otherwise a crisis, and not ignore the tools that you have spent 20 years developing and put your hope in a basket of tools that you've never really successfully been able to scale. That's just not rational behavior.
I wanted to bring you back to this idea of willingness to pay. If it's $400 a ton for a removal credit. And I think one area that you've been writing on pretty extensively over the course of this year has been the carbon offsetting and reduction scheme for international aviation, CORSIA. And I think that's a wonderful use case for willingness to pay, right? In that airline travel, it's important for business, it's important for people's leisure. It's not heating your home, it's not keeping the lights on. There's some element where there could be flexibility in creating that, okay, maybe I need to pay more because of the very direct connection to emissions with jet fuel, for example. And I wonder if you look at that use case and how that's being implemented, could you describe where we are right now in CORSIA? Is that an area where you're saying, maybe this is a path forward for a more pragmatic approach and taking some of these tools that we've developed over the past 20 years and implementing them in more of a compliance scheme?
Thank you for highlighting the work we've been doing in the CORSIA space, particularly the two papers. There's a third paper coming out soon as well, which is much more focused on sustainable aviation fuels. The takeaway that I would have is there is a danger when you blur the line between what is a voluntary market and what is a compliance market. And one of the big challenges that I think CORSIA has faced is its transition from what it calls the pilot phase, where essentially it allowed voluntary carbon units to be used by airlines to meet voluntary or pilot phase commitments, which were none, versus what we're seeing in the first phase of CORSIA, where the credits have to be of a certain minimum integrity and grade, because there is a concern that international aviation emissions, which are accounted for under the ICAO treaty, when measured or compared against or adjusted against offsets that are generated within countries that are Paris Agreement countries using a Paris Agreement accounting ledger, are capable of being used or double counted or double claimed. That's the concern that has driven the differential treatment to how the same tons that worked for the pilot phase of CORSIA can no longer be used in the first phase of CORSIA. And in order to deal with the perception of this problem, which is when a country enables a carbon offset to be achieved by delivering on the methodology that leads to a -1 abatement, that reflects a reduction in that country's ledger, if you will, the accounting balance sheet. And when an international aviation ton, which is outside that country's ledger, outside the Paris Agreement ledger, is then subject to an adjustment because you're taking the +1 from the international aviation emission and neutralizing it or offsetting it with the -1 ton produced by the country. The concern is that that is a claim being made by an airline on the one hand, as well as being reported as part of that country's GHG accounting ledger in the country, and therefore that is some form of double claim. I don't know that that double claim concern justifies what follows next, which is that the tool to address the problem has been to force a country, the host country who's allowing the ton to be used by CORSIA, to require a corresponding adjustment of that country's NDC balance sheet. And the reason why I say that that's not necessarily a justified tool is because the idea of corresponding adjustments is a tool that only was ever designed in respect of transfers occurring between two countries who are using Article 6 units under the Paris Agreement to help meet their NDCs. That's the scenario where both countries have to do a corresponding adjustment. One does a plus on their balance sheet, and the using country does a minus in their balance sheet. And that's a double counting issue. What you then have is where you use the unit for voluntary purposes or CORSIA purposes, where the host country, if it is an Article 6 unit, has to then do a corresponding adjustment. And that's the Article 6 rule. But what the CORSIA tab has done, the Technical Advisory Board has done, is they've said, these voluntary stuff that we were using in pilot phase, why don't we get the countries to apply corresponding adjustment against their voluntary stuff? So now you're blurring the line between what is an Article 6 unit and a tool of corresponding adjustment that is designed around an Article 6 unit. And you are now forcing that tool to be used in something that is not an Article 6 unit. So what you're now doing is you're blurring the line between voluntary and compliance, because you're now saying the voluntary ton suddenly overnight becomes a compliance ton if a host country is willing to bear the penalty of doing a corresponding adjustment. Now, that's fine, but you are really blurring the lines there. And if you're going to blur the lines, better well be clear about how corresponding adjustment is going to work. But we can't be clear about that because it's a tool developed under Article 6. And guess what? Article 6 hasn't been able to be created in any real way to be properly up and running because at COP28, parties decided that they couldn't agree on how Article 6 should work properly. And that's been kicked into the dust at least until COP29 and maybe even beyond that. And this is after the fact that it took till COP26 before we can even agree that Article 6 should be made operational. Now it's operational in theory, but not up and running. So we don't actually know how corresponding adjustment should or should not work. And yet we have CORSIA saying that that is the tool in order to deal with this perception that we have about double claim. So, you're running way ahead of what the market solutions are capable of delivering. You're dumping sovereign risk on airlines or on the standards who are otherwise being asked to ensure that the corresponding adjustment is being done by the host country. And you're doing so for a perceived risk that is probably not as big a deal as you think it is. So you're painting yourself into a corner unnecessarily, almost setting yourself up to fail. Because one of the practical consequences of the countries not being ready for Article 6 purposes is that they don't have a corresponding adjustment framework in place. And without a corresponding adjustment framework in place, the tons that are otherwise supposed to be supplied into CORSIA cannot benefit from the corresponding adjustment. So you are in this position where you've painted yourself in the corner for no particularly good reason. You're setting yourself up to fail. And guess what? The people lurking around the corner who are waiting for you to fail are the EU, who have previously tried to bring international aviation into the EU ETS. The way they did with shipping last year, they did that with aviation back in 2008. And they put this temporary pause on it based on, well, if you go and make a successor for CORSIA, then I don't need to have this pause. But I will stop the clock on this pause if CORSIA doesn't work. And guess what? We're designing CORSIA so it doesn't work because we're insisting on blurring the line between what is a voluntary solution and a compliance market solution without necessarily thinking about whether or not the tools are fit for the purpose. So in one sense, I feel that CORSIA is almost being set up to fail so that you can be in a position where all of a sudden in 2 years' time, the EU turns around and says, you know what, they've given you 10 years to sort yourself out, CORSIA. It's clearly not working. There's no deliverable supply into this market. So that's where I think the unfortunate state of play with CORSIA is today. Can it change? Yes, it can. Will it change overnight? I don't think so.
And we saw one of those very practical consequences just the past week when the Intercontinental Exchange, ICE, suspended its December 24 CORSIA eligible emissions units futures contract after a lack of deliverable supply of credits drove traders to close all of their positions in that particular futures contract. Listening to you, coming back more and more to that sense at the beginning of the conversation that we're really kind of seeing large disagreements about the type of system we should have playing out in these smaller details. So whether it's between the EU model and the CORSIA approach, whether it's between the voluntary markets and more of a Paris regulatory scheme, it seems like we're having a lot of these disagreements over what seem like small technical matters, but it's really driven by wanting a different approach to how we do things, and a little bit of a fight over systems between different groups. And I guess that brings me a little bit to the European Union model, which is to take its own cap and trade, the ETS, and try to export its carbon price and expand the scope of its regulations beyond its borders. This began arguably with the carbon border adjustment mechanism. You mentioned international shipping, and is now also being expanded through new methane regulation that you've written about. So I was wondering if you could kind of walk us through that approach that the EU is taking and how it's being implemented through these new methane regulations.
So the methane regulation, like CBAM, which you just mentioned, is in one sense, I would hesitate to use the word protectionist, because the argument that the EU would say is that it's not a protectionist tool. But in practice, it has a protectionist effect. And I'll explain why. What CBAM is otherwise saying is, as we've talked about, I think, in a previous podcast, is that the EU doesn't necessarily say to a foreign country who is exporting its aluminium to the EU that I expect you to pay me for the carbon cost differential between your country and my country when it comes to aluminium GHG emission tons from production. I expect you to put a price yourself, and you will bear that price, and in which case I will recognize that you've got a carbon price, and therefore I will not have to take your money. I mean, that would be the effect of the CBAM policy on the face of it. But the reality is a country like Indonesia may not be able to bear an 80 euro a ton carbon price, not on day one, maybe in 2060, maybe in 2070, but in the meantime, it can't. But the EU CBAM policy doesn't recognize that Indonesia is not the same economy as the EU and therefore cannot bear a carbon price, which is the same price as the EU. So it always lands up being the case that for political and other practical reasons, no third country government like Indonesia, in my example, will put an 80 euro a ton price on aluminium anytime in the next, I would say, 5 years. And therefore, for 5 years, the EU will receive a lot of money as a compensation to protect its own industry for the loss of business that will follow to the aluminium sector from carbon leakage. And that's the reality. And what they're doing with the methane regulation is recognizing that there is an effort to ensure that methane emissions are managed better than they are. There's been a disproportionate focus on CO2 emissions. If you think about what all of the EU ETS processes have been, they've started out by predominantly trying to regulate CO2 emissions, and then they've expanded into other greenhouse gases. And CO2 emissions are what we have the most in the atmosphere. But actually, methane emission abatement is a very, very powerful thing to do because it has a disproportionate atmospheric effect, because methane is so much more environmentally damaging than CO2 emissions. And one of the reasons why the US and China have maintained dialogue and cooperation around methane is because they both recognize that that has actually more effect in terms of environmental benefits than talking about CO2 between the two of them. So the EU's position that they would adopt a approach that therefore controls or tries to control methane emissions is not surprising. But what they're really saying is that we have in the regulations to restrict the sources of emissions associated with methane in coal, oil, and LNG production. And we think that other countries should adopt standards that are not too dissimilar from ours. So the methane regulations, like CBAM, starts off by saying, I expect you to deliver to me GHG data associated with production. And that's the story for the first 2 years. And then 2 years later, they say, well, actually, thank you for the data you gave me, but it's not in the MRV standard that I would expect. And therefore, I would like you to do it to my MRV standard. So you're adding the operational administrative burden on the producer to start supplying that data. And then it says 2 years after that actually, you know what? Thank you for that data, but now I want the methane intensity data rather than just the actual GHG data. So I now need you to report methane intensity. Oh, and by the way, 8 years from now, just be aware, I'm going to set a methane intensity benchmark, which means that if your benchmark is, if the product that you are selling doesn't fall below this benchmark, then I'm not going to allow that methane source of product, whether that's oil, coal, or LNG, and in which case you are very welcome to sell it elsewhere. So when you start thinking about points that Daniel Rogan, I think, made in your most recent podcast with him about how governments are moving away from focusing on decarbonization because they have to recognize security of supply, you're now in this situation where you're painting yourself into a corner again by insisting that only certain types of products can come into the EU that meet the criteria that you are setting. And by the way, you very well know from past behavior that as soon as push comes to crunch and you have a Ukraine-style energy crisis caused by suddenly stopping your source of supply, you're going to roll back on every rule that you've ever written because it suits you on the justification of energy security. So why put in place a set of rules that paints yourself into a corner, knowing fully well that when a crisis happens, you're going to ignore your own rules, but in the meantime, you're going to force your rules on down everybody else's throat? And that seems to be the general direction of how both CBAM works, as well as how the methane regulations work. Oh, and by the way, that's not the end of it. You've got the deforestation regulation, you've got the supply chain due diligence regulation, and all of these regulations are more or less designed around the same approach, which is we, the EU, believes that our way of doing things is the way the rest of the world has to do it. And if you think you want to supply your goods into our market, and you believe that our market is an important thing for you to sell into, then by all means, you will follow our rules. And that basically is more what I describe as a stick, because they're saying that it's your condition for market access, than it is a carrot, which says, I'm going to pay you a green premium, by the way, for you being a good corporate producing citizen and producing these things according to my rule. They're not saying for 1 minute there is a premium attached to being a good corporate supplier. But what that translates to, in fact, is the price of market access, and it's the price that the supplier has to pay, which ultimately is going to be borne by the citizen, because the cost of that EU condition, EU-based supply is going to be so much higher than what another country that isn't following the same rules is going to apply. So then you realize that in order to protect the EU from that lack of competition, it has no choice but to actually insist on imposing its rules on other countries to avoid that loss of competition. And that's where you start seeing the beginnings of trade wars between countries.
First off, I want to thank you for the conversation. It's always great. And I wanted to ask you a question. You've used the phrase a few times in this conversation now, which is painting ourselves into a corner. And it seems like there's a lot of examples where either we're painting ourselves into a corner or we're painting someone else into a corner. So I wanted to ask you, when you look around, what is the big thing we need to be doing or focusing on so that we stop painting ourselves into a corner? Because we do need to make meaningful, fast progress here.
I think the challenge has been market mechanisms are good because they're less bureaucratic, they're more nimble and more capable of adapting to circumstances in providing solutions. So private sector innovation has always been capable of addressing a lot of things that government sector policy approaches haven't necessarily been able to approach. And policy approaches which are less market orientated, which is a lot of what the stick solutions being thrown out there are, have one very clear-cut effect, which is they do force you to do things that you didn't otherwise want to do. In other words, they take voluntary choice away from you and convert it into compulsion. Now, if you legislate compulsive behavior or change in behavior, which is what all of these regulations are designed to do, what you're doing with legislation is you're writing a rule book, and therefore you are creating a rigid set of formulaic approaches that limit people's choices, because in order to do anything different, they run the risk of breaching the law. And if you start breaching the law, then you have to start paying penalties. And that means you don't do it, because you've literally got no choice but to comply with the law. Most corporations don't go out there looking to break the law. They look to comply with the law. So you're leaving yourself with zero flexibility when circumstances happen that you had not counted on when the legislation was passed. You know, if you think about the Paris Agreement, it was designed at a time when what I would call peak globalization. 10 years on, we look at the Paris Agreement and we say, well, it was designed around a globalized world, but we don't really have a globalized world anymore. So how is that going to work? Did we foresee deglobalization when the Paris Agreement was being negotiated? Probably not. Is that what we have today? Yes, that's the reality. So when you start passing legislation which forces behavior rather than let market forces impose or change behavior, you do achieve results, but you do it in a much more restricted and rigid way. And that's the difference, if you will, between maybe the IRA approach in the US, the Inflation Reduction Act, and what the EU is doing in terms of mandating or obliging people are doing in a very prescriptive way. And that prescriptive way doesn't leave you with flexibility, it doesn't leave you with adaptability. And if it does, it comes out with delay and at a cost. And that cost is ultimately borne by the citizens. So that's why I talk about painting yourself into the corner is a bad thing, but why I also say, don't give up faith on market mechanisms, because you, in one sense, the flexibility to deal with crisis through the market is what you've historically been doing for all this time. And to suddenly move away from that without knowing what the alternative is and how the alternative is going to deliver it, I think is a very scary proposition.
Well, thanks for taking some time away from your summer to spend with us, Peter. It's always great catching up with you. I did want to ask you, before you go, this is our summer playlist series, and it's become a bit of a tradition to ask each of our guests what's on their personal beach reading list this summer. So I wanted to ask you, what are you reading this summer, Peter?
Well, first of all, I don't read that much because I feel that my entire job is based on reading all day long. But when I do pick up a book, I do so with a great deal of sort of thought on topics that I really want to learn all about. So I came across a book published by a historian called Satnam Sangaram, and it's called Empire World: How British Imperialism Shaped the Globe. I haven't read it yet. It's on my, as you say, my to-do list for my summer holidays. But I'm looking forward to sort of seeing how, with the prism of, with the ability to look back and see the consequences of your actions, what the future tells you that you didn't know at the time you did it, but is a consequence of what you do. And that I think has parallels with the world we're about to walk into right now.
Thanks again to Peter Zaman, partner at HFW in Singapore. We hope you enjoyed the episode. We'll be back next week with another episode of our Summer Playlist 2024. We hope you'll join us.
This episode was brought to you in part by Abax Exchange, where trading in centrally cleared, physically deliverable LNG and carbon futures contracts is now underway. Ready for smarter markets? Contact us at onboarding@abax.exchange. That concludes this week's episode of Smarter Markets by Abax. For episode transcripts and additional episode information, including research, editorial, and video content, please visit smartermarkets.media. Please help more people discover the podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Smarter Markets is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on Smarter Markets should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on Smarter Markets are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or producer. Smarter Markets, its hosts, guests, employees, and producer, Abax Technologies, shall not be held liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on informational viewpoints presented on Smarter Markets. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.